at sea, he's quarantined.
It's true.
He's like,
That's
they've
true.
all taken
They'll still
COVID
know.
tests.
We'll do that.
But then you'll already be a part of our house.
Too much. It's too
And
much.
therefore,
Oh my god!
Look at what they can do.
It's magic.
Oh my god! They hug each other.
That's so nice. I recommend adopting your solo friends so they too can get all of the cuddles
That's
from
true.
you.
If you know anyone who might be solo,
Adopt them.
they may not know that you're willing to adopt them. So you should
Yeah,
reach
it's
out.
true.
Yeah.
I was having a conversation with a friend who was too shy to ask anyone to adopt them. So,
Adopt your solo
yeah,
friends.
check in with your solo
I
friends.
feel like that's a campaign we should do.
Go down to your local shelter
Yeah.
and adopt a friend.
Frankie, are you going to be okay? No, okay. We need you to tell. Wait, no, shit. We need someone else. Quick,
You've got to say the thing, quick.
quick, emergency.
Everything, absolutely everything is going to be just fine.
Okay,
Was that the thing?
thank you.
Okay.
Beautifully delivered as always.
Oh,
Everything is going to.
It is going to be okay.
Yeah, absolutely everything.
This is the future.
How is it? How is it in the future?
But thank you. It'll be better when you can
Yeah.
join us in the
Yeah.
future.
Yeah, this is just a
And
modicum.
Gordon and
piece.
everyone else.
Can't wait to fucking touch you all.
This is
Hello?
all going to be on this floor.
Hello.
I can't wait.
And the cat.
Good.
We were just debating how many blues dancers you could fit on the sofa.
I'm on a Zoom call at the moment.
Jonas has changed quite a lot.
Hear things. What was that?
Yeah.
Sorry?
lockdown will do that to you.
Wow, Jonas, you shaved your beard off.
Put your hair out.
You put your beard
Change
on
the
your
shape of
head.
your face.
You can just
What
find
do you
myself,
think?
And I can.
You
Great.
You look gorgeous.
Yeah?
look amazing. I mean, it was also great before, but this.
Shall I
look
keep it this way though?
Um,
Well, I can get
yeah.
that just now.
you could maybe, Gordon, my darling, can you mute yourself, or shall I mute you?
Yes. Unless you want to just, if you want to buy them both, that might be.
Gordon's buying a boat.
What?
Buy them both.
Probably for the
Inspired
best.
by
to
Earthsea.
mute that conversation.
Lisa, are you just being handed spoonfuls of yummy things?
Oh my God, what are you being handed?
Cream blended with Werther's Originals.
What blended with the
Double cream.
double
Blended with
cream?
How
Werther's
do you
Originals.
blend them? They're like little shards. You've got candy shrapnel.
I want to do it.
It's going to be turned into ice cream. If
God.
any of it makes it that far.
Damn, that sounds good.
Oh,
Yeah.
Jonas has really got a touch with this interesting ice cream flavors thing, huh?
Gordon, we had to mute you.
Yeah, sorry, Gordon.
You were talking about boats too much.
oh, okay. Lisa, Kitty and I have postulated for a couple of years now. We bought an ice cream maker and then we never actually realized the dream. Do you think it's possible to develop a honey mustard flavor ice cream?
Yeah.
Oh, see, okay, you say that, but you got the creamy, you got the tangy, you've got the sweet.
I'm into it.
I mean, it's
Sounds
definitely
amazing.
possible to make it. Whether or not it'll taste good is another matter entirely.
I mean, I wouldn't put any vinegar in it. Yeah, I'm not saying like lazy French mustard. You're doing like some Dijon or something,
Yeah, proper
like
whole
cracked mustard seeds in it, maybe. But
Yeah, like
see?
Shall I ask Jonas if he wants to workshop it and he can just give you
Yes,
the
that would be
end
rad.
result recipe?
Yeah.
Somebody who actually knows what they're doing. Yeah. TM copyright Rory McKinnon. This is a recorded session too, so you can't.
Chunks of ham.
What do you serve at
Can't screw me on this one, Jonas.
This is how you make your quarantine million.
Look,
Mhm.
I'm thinking more because chili in ice cream.
Would you
Chili and
serve it with hot mayonnaise?
Mm.
but
Oh, not the hot mayonnaise again.
Oh God.
Mm.
Oh, Happy Bubble House! Yay!
I when I was in my dim and distant past, I went on a school trip to Rome, and my friend Hannah at the time, we went and got ice cream at this sort of, lovely little gelato place, and she ordered what she thought was chocolate ice cream, and then spent like a good 15 minutes completely freaking out, thinking she was having some sort of violent allergic reaction to the shellfish, which we had kind of got her to have for lunch in the interest of broadening her horizons. And she'd be like, oh no, I've never had shellfish, I might be allergic. I'm like, why would you think that you were allergic to shell? Like, you're probably just have the shellfish. She wasn't allergic, and then she properly had a meltdown on the streets of Rome, thinking that she was dying and her throat was closing up. Turned out it was like chili chocolate ice cream.
Oh, that sounds.
She hadn't realized. She thought it was just plain chocolate, so she was like, oh, my mouth's on fire with you.
I can confirm that's a difficult thing.
What?
That's not. Well, chili chocolate, anything if you're not expecting it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm not like diminishing the unexpected. Like, any taste of anything when you're not expecting it is genuinely like shocking. But it turns out that
But also,
story, she wasn't having an allergic reaction to shellfish. It's fine.
yeah, like a little bit of is different from anaphylactic shock. I have a friend, Kaylee, who had the opposite thing, where like she is deathly allergic to peanuts, but she was so excited when she was 14 that someone had made peanut brownies for her that she forgot that she was allergic and just plowed right into
Oh no!
Yeah, it was great.
Oh no!
I know, but like that says a lot about how like chirpy and lovely a person she is. She's just, oh fuck yeah, brownies! You made them for me, amazing. Peanut. Why is my throat 3 times the normal size?
Like walking to
Why can't I see anything? How do I do this?
Me and my sister went to the tattoo with some of our friends when we were children, and my sister and her friend were halfway through a bag of peanut M&Ms when her mum turned around to my mum and said, she's allergic to peanuts. Turns out she wasn't actually allergic to peanuts. Her mum was just overreacting. But like in the middle of 10,000 people in a stadium outside in Edinburgh in the middle of the night is not when you want to have an anaphylactic shock with a small child.
Nope. Or even like a scare for an anaphylactic shock with a small child. I imagine that put the frighteners right up your mum.
I mean, she is a GP.
Oh, she's probably fine then.
Oh my god, like my friend Aaron has the most ridiculously intense anaphylactic shock story. Like when we were living in Slovakia together, he was in the east of Slovakia hiking, and he was like halfway up a mountain in a little mountain hata, like kind of hut, and he was drinking and everybody else was drinking heavily because they're Slovak, and like so everybody in the place is blind drunk, and like Aaron has had quite a lot to drink but is not blind drunk. And this guy stumbles in the door and says he's been stung by a wasp and is having like a hospitalizing anaphylactic shock. And this is about 3 a.m, right? And so Aaron is the only person who can stand up straight, has to drive this old, like 40-year-old Skoda 102 down the side of a mountain in the dark, in the snow, to a motorway, and then flag down a passing car and be like, I'm too drunk to be driving. Take this man to hospital. Like,
that's so responsible.
Like, Aaron is like the most responsible person in the world. Like, he's the only person that I know that would not have died in that situation.
Did he then sleep in the car?
Yeah.
Yeah. Did he find out whether the guy was okay? Like, did they?
Done. My bit's done. You're on your own.
That's possibly the icing on the cake on that as a intense story. Like, I don't know what happened to them.
I mean, you know, I think he did sterling work.
My mum once got a free duck because she gave someone an EpiPen who was having an anaphylactic shock because they'd eaten shellfish, even though they knew they were allergic to shellfish and they didn't have their EpiPen with them. Both my parents were fairly hammered, but Mum was the less drunk person, so she went to find an EpiPen for this guy, and he was like, "I've been shooting, would you like this duck?"
A living duck or a
dead duck?
Cooked duck.
A dead, uncooked duck.
A dead. Oh wow, gosh, that's sort of the worst of both worlds.
I think that says more about the company that your parents keep than anything else, really.
Oh, they weren't with them. They were in a hotel that was nearby.
Do you think he had that? What's that thing where you like he had some sort of moment when he was leaving the house, and instead of grabbing his EpiPen, he grabbed the duck. Like they were like both like sitting on the counter in the kitchen, and maybe he was like on the phone or something. You know, when you like, you like open a packet of sandwich and you throw the sandwich away, and you're just stood holding the empty packet like an idiot. You know that thing.
I like the fact that the story goes is like at the doctor's like, would you like this regular EpiPen or would you like the duck-shaped EpiPen? And he's like, obviously the duck-shaped EpiPen.
Speaking of really horrible things happening to people, Storytime?
Oh good, I'm so glad we're having this conversation. Please tell your story.
What a segue.
No, I was saying Storytime.
Oh! In that case, that's an excellent segue, and I retract my slightly salty comment. Yeah, how are we doing for time?
Storytime.
Over time.
It was Lisa all along.
What?
Outrageous.
My God.
Oh dear.
Lies and deceit.
Can't believe you fell for it.
Where's the trust? Where's the trust, huh?
And a total lack of remorse.
God damn it. Right. Do we think it's story time? How we feel about story time? Good? Okay. Okay. So, where had we got to? Okay. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. If you remember, Jane has a cold at Netherfield, and now Elizabeth is stuck there as well with her. So, Chapter 8. At 5 o'clock, the two ladies retired to dress, and at 6:30, Elizabeth was summoned to dinner. To the civil inquiries which then poured in, and amongst which she had the pleasure of distinguishing the much superior solicitude of Mr. Bingley's, she could not make a very favourable answer. Jane was by no means better. The sisters, on hearing this, repeated 3 or 4 times how much they were grieved, how shocking it was to have a bad cold, and how excessively they disliked being ill themselves, and then thought no more of the matter. And their indifference towards Jane, when not immediately before them, restored Elizabeth to the enjoyment of all her original dislike. Their brother, indeed, was the only one of the party whom she could regard with any complacency. His anxiety for Jane was evident, and his attentions to herself most pleasing, and they prevented her feeling herself so much an intruder as she believed she was considered by the others. She had very little notice from any but him. Miss Bingley was engrossed by Mr. Darcy, her sister scarcely less so. And as for Mr. Hurst, by whom Elizabeth sat, he was an indolent man who lived only to eat, drink, and play at cards, who, when he found her prefer a plain dish to a ragout, had nothing to say to her. When dinner was over, she returned directly to Jane, and Miss Bingley began abusing her as soon as she was out of the room. Her manners were pronounced to be very bad indeed, a mixture of pride and impertinence. She had no conversation, no style, no taste, no beauty. Mrs. Hurst thought the same, and added, "She has nothing, in short, to recommend her but being an excellent walker. I shall never forget her appearance this morning. She really looked almost wild." "She did indeed, Louisa. I could hardly keep my countenance. Very nonsensical to come at all. Why must she be scampering about the country because her sister had a cold? Her hair so untidy, so blousy. Yes, and her petticoat. I hope you saw her petticoat 6 inches deep in mud, I am absolutely certain, and the gown which had been let down to hide it, not doing its office." "Your picture may be very exact, Louisa," said Bingley, "but all this was lost upon me. I thought Miss Elizabeth Bennet looked remarkably well when she came into the room this morning. Her dirty petticoat quite escaped my notice." "You observed it, Mr. Darcy, I am sure," said Miss Bingley, "and I am inclined to think that you would not wish to see your sister make such an exhibition." "Certainly not." "To walk 3 miles, or 4 miles, or 5 miles, or whatever it is, above her ankles in dirt, and alone, quite alone. What could she mean by it? It seems to me to show an abominable sort of conceited independence, a most country town indifference to decorum." "It shows an affection for her sister that is very pleasing," said Bingley. "I am afraid, Mr. Darcy," observed Miss Bingley in a half whisper, "that this adventure has rather affected your admiration of her fine eyes." "Not at all," he replied. "They were brightened by the exercise." A short pause followed this speech, and Mrs. Hurst began again. "I have an excessive regard for Jane Bennet. She is really a very sweet girl, and I wish with all my heart she were well settled. But such a father and mother, and such low connections, I am afraid there is no chance of it." "I think I have heard you say that their uncle is an attorney in Meryton." "Yes, and they have another who lives somewhere near Cheapside." "That is capital," added her sister, and they both laughed heartily. "If they had uncles enough to fill all Cheapside," cried Bingley, "it would not make them one jot less agreeable." "But it must very materially lessen their chance of marrying men of any consideration in the world," replied Darcy. To this speech Bingley made no answer, but his sisters gave it their hearty assent, and indulged their mirth for some time at the expense of their dear friend's vulgar relations. With a renewal of tenderness, however, they repaired to her room on leaving the dining parlour, and sat with her till summoned to coffee. She was still very poorly, and Elizabeth would not quit her at all till late in the evening, when she had the comfort of seeing her asleep, and when it appeared to her rather right than pleasant that she should go downstairs herself. On entering the drawing-room, she found the whole party at loo, and was immediately invited to join them, but suspecting them to be playing high, she declined it, and making her sister the excuse, said she would amuse herself for the short time she could stay below with a book. Mr. Hurst looked at her with astonishment. "Do you prefer cards to reading?" said he. "That is rather singular." "Miss Eliza Bennet," said Miss Bingley, "despises cards. She is a great reader, and has no pleasure in anything else." "I deserve neither such praise nor such censure," cried Elizabeth. "I am not a great reader, and I have pleasure in many things." "In nursing your sister, I am sure you have pleasure," said Bingley, "and I hope it will soon be increased by seeing her quite well." Elizabeth thanked him from her heart, and then walked towards a table where a few books were lying. He immediately offered to fetch her others, all that his library afforded. "And I wish my collection were larger for your benefit and my own credit. But I am an idle fellow, and though I have not many, I have many more than I ever look into." Elizabeth assured him that she could suit herself perfectly with those in the room. "I am astonished," said Miss Bingley, "that my father should have left so small a collection of books. What a delightful library you have at Pemberley, Mr. Darcy." "It ought to be good," he replied. "It has been the work of many generations." "And then you have added so much to it yourself. You are always buying books." "I cannot comprehend the neglect of a family library in such days as these." "Neglect? I am sure you neglect nothing that can add to the beauties of that noble place. Charles, when you build your house, I wish it may be half as delightful as Pemberley." "I wish it may." "But I would really advise you to make your purchase in that neighbourhood and take Pemberley for a kind of model. There is not a finer county in England than Derbyshire." "With all my heart. I will buy Pemberley itself if Darcy will sell it." "I am talking of possibilities, Charles." "Upon my word, Caroline, I should think it more possible to get Pemberley by purchase than by imitation." Elizabeth was so much caught by what passed as to leave her very little attention for her book, and soon laying it wholly aside, she drew near the card table and stationed herself between Mr. Bingley and his eldest sister to observe the game. "Is Miss Darcy much grown since the spring?" said Miss Bingley. "Will she be as tall as I am?" "I think she will. She is now about Miss Elizabeth Bennet's height, or rather taller." "How I long to see her again. I never met with anybody who delighted me so much. Such a countenance, such manners, and so extremely accomplished for her age. Her performance on the pianoforte is exquisite." "It is amazing to me," said Bingley, "how young ladies can have patience to be so very accomplished, as they all are." "All young ladies accomplished? My dear Charles, what do you mean?" "Yes, all of them, I think. They all paint tables, cover screens, and net purses. I scarcely know anyone who cannot do all this, and I am sure I never heard a young lady spoken of for the first time without being informed that she was very accomplished." "Your list of the common extent of accomplishments," said Darcy, "has too much truth. The word is applied to many a woman who deserves it no otherwise than by netting a purse or covering a screen. But I am very far from agreeing with you in your estimation of ladies in general. I cannot boast of knowing more than half a dozen in the whole range of my acquaintance that are really accomplished." "Nor I am sure," said Miss Bingley. "Then," observed Elizabeth, "you must comprehend a great deal in your idea of an accomplished woman." "Yes, I do comprehend a great deal in it." "Oh, certainly," cried his faithful assistant. "No one can be really esteemed accomplished who does not greatly surpass what is usually met with. A woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages to deserve the word. And besides all this, she must possess a certain something in her air and manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address and expressions, or the word will be but half deserved." "All this she must possess," added Darcy, "and to all this she must yet add something more substantial, in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading." "I am no longer surprised at your knowing only 6 accomplished women. I rather wonder now at your knowing any." "Are you so severe upon your own sex to doubt the possibility of all this?" "I never saw such a woman. I never saw such capacity and taste and application and elegance as you describe united." Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley both cried out against the injustice of her implied doubt, and were both protesting that they knew many women who answered this description, when Mr. Hurst called them to order, with bitter complaints of their inattention to what was going forward. As all conversation was thereby at an end, Elizabeth soon afterwards left the room. "Eliza Bennet," said Miss Bingley when the door was closed on her, "is one of those young ladies who seek to recommend themselves to the other sex by undervaluing their own, and with many men I dare say it succeeds. But in my opinion it is a paltry device, a very mean art." "Undoubtedly," replied Darcy, to whom this remark was chiefly addressed. "There is meanness in all the arts which ladies sometimes condescend to employ to captivation. Whatever bears affinity to cunning is despicable." Miss Bingley was not so entirely satisfied with this reply as to continue the subject. Elizabeth joined them again, only to say that her sister was worse, and that she could not leave her. Bingley urged Mr. Jones's being sent for immediately, while his sisters, convinced that no country advice could be of any service, recommended an express to town for one of the most eminent physicians. This she would not hear of, but she was not so unwilling to comply with their brother's proposal, and it was settled that Mr. Jones should be sent for early in the morning if Miss Bennet were not decidedly better. Bingley was quite uncomfortable. His sisters declared that they were miserable. They solaced their wretchedness, however, by duets after supper, while he could find no better relief to his feelings than by giving his housekeeper directions that every possible attention might be paid to the sick lady and her sister. Chapter 9. Elizabeth passed the chief of the night in her sister's room, and in the morning had the pleasure of being able to send a tolerable answer to the inquiries which she very early received from Mr. Bingley by a housemaid, and some time afterwards from the two elegant ladies who waited on his sisters. In spite of this amendment, however, she requested to have a note sent to Longbourn, desiring her mother to visit Jane and form her own judgment of the situation. The note was immediately dispatched, and its contents as quickly complied with. Mrs. Bennet, accompanied by her two youngest girls, reached Netherfield soon after the family breakfast. Had she found Jane in any apparent danger, Mrs. Bennet would have been very miserable. But being satisfied on seeing her that her illness was not alarming, she had no wish of her recovering immediately, as her restoration to health would probably remove her from Netherfield. She would not listen, therefore, to her daughter's proposal of being carried home. Neither did the apothecary, who arrived about the same time, think it at all advisable. After sitting a little while with Jane, on Miss Bingley's appearance and invitation, the mother and three daughters all attended her into the breakfast parlour. Bingley met them with hopes that Mrs. Bennet had not found Miss Bennet worse than she expected. "Indeed I have, sir," was her answer. "She is a great deal too ill to be moved. Mr. Jones says we must not think of moving her. We must trespass a little longer on your kindness." "Removed?" cried Bingley. "It must not be thought of. My sister, I am sure, will not hear of her removal." "You may depend upon it, madam," said Miss Bingley with cold civility, "that Miss Bennet shall receive every possible attention while she remains with us." Mrs. Bennet was profuse in her acknowledgments. "I am sure," she added, "if it was not for such good friends, I do not know what would have become of her, for she is very ill indeed, and suffers a vast deal, although with the greatest patience in the world, which is always the way with her, for she has, without exception, the sweetest temper I ever met with. I often tell my other girls they are nothing to her. You have a sweet room here, Mr. Bingley, and a charming prospect over that gravel walk. I do not know a place in the country that is equal to Netherfield. You will not think of quitting it in a hurry, I hope, though you have but a short lease." "Whatever I do is done in a hurry," he replied, "and therefore if I should resolve to quit Netherfield, I should probably off in 5 minutes. At present, however, I consider myself as quite fixed here." "That is exactly what I should have supposed of you," said Elizabeth. You begin to comprehend me, do you? Cried he, turning towards her. Oh, yes, I understand you perfectly. I wish I might take this for a compliment, but to be so easily seen through, I am afraid, is pitiful. That is as it happens. It does not necessarily follow that a deep, intricate character is more or less estimable than such a one as yours. Lizzie, cried her mother, remember where you are and do not run on in the wild manner that you are suffered to at home. I did not know before, continued Bingley immediately, that you were a studier of character. It must be an amusing study. Yes, but intricate characters are the most amusing. They have at least that advantage. The country, said Darcy, can in general supply but few subjects for such a study. In a country neighbourhood you moved in a very confined and unvarying society. But people alter themselves so much that there is something new to be observed in them forever. Yes, indeed, cried Mrs. Bennet, offended by his manner of mentioning a country neighbourhood. I assure you there is quite as much of that going on in the country as in town. Everybody was surprised, and Darcy, after looking at her for a moment, turned away. Mrs. Bennet, who fancied she had gained a complete victory over him, continued her triumph. I cannot see that London has any great advantage over the country for my part, except the shops and public places. The country is a vast deal pleasanter, is it not, Mr. Bingley? When I am in the country, he replied, I never wish to leave it. And when I'm in the town, it is pretty much the same. They each have their advantages, and I can be equally happy in each. Aye, that is because you have the right disposition. But that gentleman, looking at Darcy, seemed to think the country was nothing at all. Indeed, mamma, you are mistaken, said Elizabeth, blushing for her mother. You quite mistook Mr. Darcy. He only meant that there were not such a variety of people to be met with in the country as in the town, which you must acknowledge to be true. Certainly, my dear, nobody said there were. But as to not meeting with many people in this neighbourhood, I believe there are few neighbourhoods larger. I know we dine with 24 families. Nothing but concern for Elizabeth could enable Bingley to keep his countenance. His sister was less delicate and directed her eye towards Mr. Darcy with a very expressive smile. Elizabeth, for the sake of saying something that might turn her mother's thoughts, now asked her if Charlotte Lucas had been at Longbourn since her coming away. Yes, she called yesterday with her father. What an agreeable man Sir William is, Mr. Bingley, is he not? So much the man of fashion, so genteel and so easy. He always has something to say to everybody. That is my idea of good breeding. And those persons who fancy themselves very important and never open their mouths quite mistake the matter. Did Charlotte dine with you? No, she would go home. I fancy she was wanted about the mince pies. For my part, Mr. Bingley, I always keep servants that could do their own work. My daughters are brought up differently. But everybody is to judge for themselves, and the Lucases are very good sorts of girls, I assure you. It is a pity they are not handsome. Not that I think Charlotte so very plain, but then she is our particular friend. She seems a very pleasant young woman, said Bingley. Oh dear, yes, but you must own she is very plain. Lady Lucas herself has often said so and envied me Jane's beauty. I do not like to boast of my own child, but to be sure, Jane, one does not often see anybody better looking. It is what anybody says. I do not trust my own partiality. When she was only 15, there was a gentleman at my brother Gardner's in town so much in love with her that my sister-in-law was sure he would make her an offer before we came away. But however, he did not. Perhaps he thought her too young. However, he wrote some verses on her, and very pretty they were. And so ended his affection, said Elizabeth impatiently. There has been many a one, I fancy, overcome in the same way. I wonder who first discovered the efficacy of poetry in driving away love. I have been used to consider poetry as the food of love, said Darcy. Of a fine, stout, healthy love it may. Everything nourishes what is strong already. But if it be only a thin, slight sort of inclination, I am convinced that one good sonnet will starve it entirely away. Darcy only smiled, and the general pause which ensued made Elizabeth tremble lest her mother should be exposing herself again. She longed to speak, but could think of nothing to say. And after a short silence, Mrs. Bennet began repeating her thanks to Mr. Bingley for his kindness to Jane, with an apology for troubling him also with Lizzie. Mr. Bingley was unaffectedly civil in his answer, and forced his younger sister to be civil also, and say what the occasion required. She performed her part indeed, without much graciousness, but Mrs. Bennet was satisfied, and soon afterwards ordered her carriage. Upon this signal, the youngest of her daughters put herself forward. The two girls had been whispering to each other during the whole visit, and the result of it was that the youngest should tax Mr. Bingley with having promised on his first coming into the country to give a ball at Netherfield. Lydia was a stout, well-grown girl of 15, with a fine complexion and good-humoured countenance, a favourite with her mother, whose affection had brought her into public at an early age. She had high animal spirits and a sort of natural self-consequence, which the attentions of the officers, to whom her uncle's good dinners and her own easy manners recommended her, had increased into assurance. She was very equal, therefore, to address Mr. Bingley on the subject of the ball, and abruptly reminded him of his promise, adding that it would be the most shameful thing in the world if he did not keep it. His answer to this sudden attack was delightful to their mother's ear. "I am perfectly ready, I assure you, to keep my engagement, and when your sister is recovered, you shall, if you please, name the very day of the ball. But you would not wish to be dancing while she is ill." Lydia declared herself satisfied. "Oh, yes, it would be much better to wait till Jane was well, and by that time most likely Captain Carter would be at Meryton again. And when you have given your ball," she added, "I shall insist on their giving one also. I shall tell Colonel Forster it will be quite a shame if he does not." Mrs. Bennet and her daughters then departed, and Elizabeth returned instantly to Jane, leaving her own and her relations' behaviour to the remarks of the two ladies and Mr. Darcy, the latter of whom, however, could not be prevailed on to join in their censure of her, in spite of all Miss Bingley's witticisms on fine eyes. Chapter 10. The day passed much as the day before had done. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley had spent some hours of the morning with the invalid, who continued, though slowly, to mend, and in the evening Elizabeth joined their party in the drawing-room. The loo table, however, did not appear. Mr. Darcy was writing, and Miss Bingley, seated near him, was watching the progress of his letter, and repeatedly calling off his attention by messages to his sister. Mr. Hurst and Mr. Bingley were at piquet, and Mrs. Hurst was observing their game. Elizabeth took up some needlework, and was sufficiently amused in attending to what passed between Darcy and his companion. The perpetual commendations of the lady, either on his handwriting, or on the evenness of his lines, or on the length of his letter, were, with the perfect unconcern with which her praises were received, formed a curious dialogue, and was exactly in unison with her opinion of each. "How delighted Miss Darcy will be to receive such a letter!" He made no answer. "You write uncommonly fast." "You are mistaken. I write rather slowly." "How many letters you must have occasion to write in the course of the year! Letters of business, too. How odious I should think them!" "It is fortunate, then, that they fall to my lot instead of to yours." "Pray tell your sister that I long to see her." "I have already told her so once by your desire." "I'm afraid you do not like your pen. Let me mend it for you. I mend pens remarkably well." "Thank you, but I always mend my own." How can you contrive to write so even? He was silent. Tell your sister I am delighted to hear of her improvement on the harp, and pray let her know that I am quite in raptures with her beautiful little design for a table, and think it infinitely superior to Miss Grantley's. Will you give me leave to defer your raptures till I write again? At present I do not have room to do them justice. Oh, it is of no consequence. I shall see her in January. But do you always write such charming long letters to her, Mr. Darcy? They are generally long, but whether always charming, it is not for me to determine. It is a rule with me that a person who can write a long letter with ease cannot write ill. That will not do for a compliment to Darcy, Caroline, cried her brother, because he does not write with ease. He studies too much for words of 4 syllables. Do not you, Darcy? My style of writing is very different from yours. Oh, cried Miss Bingley, Charles writes in the most careless way imaginable. He leaves out half his words and blots the rest. My ideas flow so rapidly that I have not time to express them, by which means my letters sometimes convey no ideas at all to my correspondents. Your humility, Mr. Bingley, said Elizabeth, must disarm reproof. Nothing is more deceitful, said Darcy, than the appearance of humility. It is often only carelessness of opinion, and sometimes an indirect boast. And which of the two do you call my little recent piece of modesty? The indirect boast. For you are really proud of your defects in writing, because you consider them as proceeding from a rapidity of thought and carelessness of execution, which, if not estimable, you think at least highly interesting. The power of doing anything with quickness is always much prized by the possessor, and often without any attention to the imperfection of the performance. When you told Mrs. Bennet this morning that if you ever resolved on quitting Netherfield, you should be gone in 5 minutes, you meant it to be a sort of panegyric, of compliment to yourself. And yet, what is there so very laudable in precipitance which must leave very necessary business undone, and can be of no real advantage to yourself or anyone else? Nay, cried Bingley, this is too much. To remember at night all the foolish things that were said in the morning. And yet, upon my honour, I believed what I said of myself to be true, and I believe it at this moment. At least, therefore, I did not assume the character of needless precipitance merely to show off before the ladies. I dare say you believed it, but I am by no means convinced that you would be gone with such celerity. Your conduct would be quite as dependent on chance as that of any man I know, and if, as you were mounting your horse, a friend were to say, Bingley, you had better stay till next week, you would probably do it. You would probably not go, and at another word, might stay a month. You have only proved by this, cried Elizabeth, that Mr. Bingley did not do justice to his own disposition. You have shown him off now much more than he did himself. I am exceedingly gratified, said Bingley, by your converting what my friend says into a compliment on the sweetness of my temper, but I am afraid you are giving it a turn which that gentleman did by no means intend, for he would certainly think the better of me if, under such circumstances, I were to give a flat denial and ride off as fast as I could. Would Mr. Darcy then consider the rashness of your original intention as atoned for by your obstinacy in adhering to it? Upon my word, I cannot exactly explain the matter. Darcy must speak for himself. You expect me to account for opinions which you choose to call mine, but which I have never acknowledged. Allowing the case, however, to stand according to your representation, you must remember, Miss Bennet, that the friend who is supposed to desire his return to the house, and the delay of his plan, has merely desired it, and asked it without offering one argument in favour of its propriety. To yield readily, easily, to the persuasion of a friend is no merit with you. To yield without conviction is no compliment to the understanding of either. You appear to me, Mr. Darcy, to allow nothing for the influence of friendship and affection. A regard for the requester would often make one readily yield to a request without waiting for arguments to reason one into it. I am not particularly speaking of such a case as you have supposed about Mr. Bingley. We may as well wait, perhaps, till a circumstance occurs before we discuss the discretion of his behaviour thereupon. But in general and ordinary cases between friend and friend, where one of them is desired by the other to change a resolution of no great moment, should you think ill of that person for complying with a desire without waiting to be argued into it? Will it not be advisable, before we proceed on this subject, to arrange with rather more precision the degree of importance which is to appertain to this request, as well as the degree of intimacy subsisting between the parties? By all means, cried Bingley, let us hear all the particulars, not forgetting their comparative height and size, for that will have more weight in the argument, Miss Bennet, than you may be aware of. I assure you that if Darcy were not such a great tall fellow in comparison with myself, I should not pay him half so much deference. I declare I do not know a more awful object than Darcy on particular occasions, and in particular places. At his own house especially, and of a Sunday evening when he has nothing to do. Mr. Darcy smiled, but Elizabeth thought she could perceive that he was rather offended, and therefore checked her laugh. Miss Bingley warmly resented the indignity he had received, in an expostulation with her brother for talking such nonsense. I see your design, Bingley, said his friend. You dislike an argument, and want to silence this. Perhaps I do. Arguments are too much like disputes. If you and Miss Bennet will defer yours till I am out of the room, I shall be very thankful, and then you may say whatever you like of me. What you ask, said Elizabeth, is no sacrifice on my side, and Mr. Darcy had much better finish his letter. Mr. Darcy took her advice, and did finish his letter. When that business was over, he applied to Miss Bingley and Elizabeth for the indulgence of some music. Miss Bingley moved with alacrity to the pianoforte, and after a polite request that Elizabeth would lead the way, which the other as politely and more earnestly negatived, she seated herself. Mrs. Hurst sang with her sister, and while they were thus employed, Elizabeth could not help observing, as she turned over some music books that lay on the instrument, how frequently Mr. Darcy's eyes were fixed on her. She hardly knew how to suppose that she could be an object of admiration to so great a man, and yet that he should look at her because he disliked her was still more strange. She could only imagine, however, at last, that she drew his notice because there was a something about her more wrong and reprehensible, according to his ideas of right, than in any other person present. The supposition did not pain her. She liked him too little to care for his approbation. After playing some Italian songs, Miss Bingley varied the charm by a lively Scottish air, and soon afterwards Mr. Darcy, drawing near Elizabeth, said to her, "Do you not feel a great inclination, Miss Bennet, to seize such an opportunity of dancing a reel?" She smiled, but made no answer. He repeated the question with some surprise at her silence. "Oh," said she, "I heard you before, but I could not immediately determine what to say in reply. You wanted me, I know, to say yes, that you might have the pleasure of despising my taste, but I always delight in overthrowing those kind of schemes and cheating a person of their premeditated contempt. I have therefore made up my mind to tell you that I do not want to dance a reel at all. And now, despise me if you dare." "Indeed, I do not dare." Elizabeth, having rather expected to affront him, was amazed at his gallantry. But there was a mixture of sweetness and archness in her manner which made it difficult for her to affront anybody, and Darcy had never been so bewitched by any woman as he was by her. He really believed that, were it not for the inferiority of her connections, he should be in some danger. Miss Bingley saw, or suspected, enough to be jealous, and her great anxiety for the recovery of her dear friend Jane received some assistance from her desire of getting rid of Elizabeth. She often tried to provoke Darcy into disliking their guest by talking of their supposed marriage and planning his happiness in such an alliance. "I hope," said she, as they were walking together in the shrubbery the next day, "you will give your future mother-in-law a few hints when the desirable event takes place as to the advantage of holding her tongue. And if you can compass it, do cure the younger girls of running after the officers. And if I may mention so delicate a subject, endeavour to check that little something bordering on conceit and impertinence which your lady possesses." "Have you anything else to propose for my domestic felicity?" "Oh, yes. Do let the portraits of your uncle and aunt Phillips be placed in the gallery at Pemberley. Put them next to your great uncle, the judge. They are in the same profession, you know, only in different lines. As for your Elizabeth's picture, you must not attempt to have it taken, for what painter could do justice to those beautiful eyes?" "It would not be easy, indeed, to catch their expression, but their colour and shape, and the eyelashes, so remarkably fine, might be copied." At that moment they were met from another walk by Mrs. Hurst and Elizabeth herself. "I did not know that you intended to walk," said Miss Bingley, in some confusion lest they had been overheard. "You used us abominably ill," answered Mrs. Hurst, "in running away without telling us that you were coming out." Then, taking the disengaged arm of Mr. Darcy, she left Elizabeth to walk by herself. The path just admitted 3. Mr. Darcy felt their rudeness and immediately said, "This walk is not wide enough for our party. We had better go into the avenue." But Elizabeth, who had not the least inclination to remain with them, laughingly answered, "No, no, stay where you are. You are charmingly grouped and appear to uncommon advantage. The picturesque would be spoilt by admitting a 4th. Goodbye." She then ran gaily off, rejoicing as she rambled about in the hope of being at home again in a day or 2. Jane was already so much recovered as to intend leaving her room for a couple of hours that evening. How are we doing for time? What time is it?
It's 5:02. There's plenty of time for another chapter.
Another chapter? One more chapter? Chapter 11. When the ladies removed after dinner, Elizabeth ran up to her sister and, seeing her well guarded from cold, attended her into the drawing room, where she was welcomed by her 2 friends with many professions of pleasure. And Elizabeth had never seen them so agreeable as they were during the hour which passed before the gentlemen appeared. Their powers of conversation were considerable. They could describe an entertainment with accuracy, relate an anecdote with humour, and laugh at their acquaintance with spirit. But when the gentlemen entered, Jane was no longer the first object. Miss Bingley's eyes were instantly turned towards Darcy, and she had something to say to him before he had advanced many steps. He addressed himself directly to Miss Bennet, with a polite congratulation. Mr. Hurst also made her a slight bow and said he was very glad, but diffuseness and warmth remained for Bingley's salutation. He was full of joy and attention. The first half hour was spent in piling up the fire, lest she should suffer from the change of room, and then she removed at his desire to the other side of the fireplace, that she might be farther from the door. He then sat down by her and talked scarcely to anyone else. Elizabeth, at work in the opposite corner, saw it all with great delight. When tea was over, Mr. Hurst reminded his sister-in-law of the card table, but in vain. She had obtained private intelligence that Mr. Darcy did not wish for cards, and Mr. Hurst soon found even his open petition rejected. She assured him that no one intended to play, and the silence of the whole party on the subject seemed to justify her. Mr. Hurst had therefore nothing to do but to stretch himself on one of the sofas and go to sleep. Mr. Darcy took up a book. Miss Bingley did the same, and Mrs. Hurst, principally occupied in playing with her bracelets and rings, joined now and then in her brother's conversation with Miss Bennet. Miss Bingley's attention was quite as much engaged in watching Mr. Darcy's progress through his book as in reading her own, and she was perpetually either making some inquiry or looking at his page. She could not win him, however, to any conversation. He merely answered her question and read on. At length, quite exhausted by the attempt to be amused with her own book, which she had only chosen because it was the second volume of his, she gave a great yawn and said, "Oh, how pleasant it is to spend an evening in this way. I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading. How much sooner one tires of anything than of a book. When I have a house of my own, I shall be miserable if I have not an excellent library." No one made any reply. She then yawned again, threw aside her book, and cast her eyes round the room in quest of some amusement. When, hearing her brother mentioning a ball to Miss Bennet, she turned suddenly towards him and said, "By the by, Charles, are you really serious in meditating a dance at Netherfield? I would advise you, before you determine on it, to consult the wishes of the present party. I am much mistaken if there are not some amongst us to whom a ball would be rather a punishment than a pleasure." "If you mean Darcy," cried her brother, "he may go to bed if he chooses before it begins. But as for the ball, it is quite a settled thing, and as soon as Nichols has made white soup enough, I shall send round my cards." "I should like balls infinitely better," she replied, "if they were carried on in a different manner. But there is something insufferably tedious in the usual process of such a meeting. It would surely be much more rational if conversation, instead of dancing, made the order of the day." "Much more rational, my dear Caroline, I dare say, but it would not be near so much like a ball." Miss Bingley made no answer, and soon afterwards got up and walked about the room. Her figure was elegant, and she walked well, but Darcy, at whom it was all aimed, was still inflexibly studious. In the desperation of her feelings, she resolved on one effort more, and, turning to Elizabeth, said, "Miss Eliza Bennet, let me persuade you to follow my example and take a turn about the room. I assure you it is very refreshing after sitting so long in one attitude." Elizabeth was surprised, but agreed to it immediately. Miss Bingley succeeded no less in the real object of her civility. Mr. Darcy looked up. He was as much awake to the novelty of attention in that quarter as Elizabeth herself could be, and unconsciously closed his book. He was directly invited to join their party, but he declined it, observing that he could imagine but two motives for their choosing to walk up and down the room together, with either of which motives his joining them would interfere. What could he mean? She was dying to know what could be his meaning, and asked Elizabeth whether she could at all understand him. "Not at all," was her answer, "but depend upon it, he means to be severe upon us, and our surest way of disappointing him will be to ask nothing about it." Miss Bingley, however, was incapable of disappointing Mr. Darcy in anything, and persevered therefore in requiring an explanation of his two motives. "I have not the smallest objection to explaining them," said he, as soon as she allowed him to speak. "You either choose this method of passing the evening because you are in each other's confidence and have secret affairs to discuss, or because you are conscious that your figures appear to the greatest advantage when walking. If the first, I should be completely in your way. If the second, I can admire you much better if I sit by the fire." "Oh, shocking!" cried Miss Bingley. "I never heard anything so abominable. How shall we punish him for such a speech?" "Nothing so easy, if you have but the inclination," said Elizabeth. "We could all plague and punish one another. Tease him, laugh at him. Intimate as you are, you must know how it is to be done." But upon my honour, I do not. I do assure you that my intimacy has not yet taught me that. Tease, calmness of temper, and presence of mind. No, I feel he may defy us there. And as to laughter, we will not expose ourselves, if you please, by attempting to laugh without a subject. Mr. Darcy may hug himself. Mr. Darcy is not to be laughed at, cried Elizabeth. That is an uncommon advantage, and uncommon I hope it will continue, for it would be a great loss to me to have many such acquaintance. I dearly love a laugh. Miss Bingley, said he, has given me credit for more than can be. The wisest and the best of men, nay, the wisest and best of their actions, may be rendered ridiculous by a person whose first object in life is a joke. Certainly, replied Elizabeth, there are such people, but I hope I am not one of them. I hope I never ridicule what is wise and good. Follies and nonsense, whims and inconsistencies do divert me, I own, and I laugh at them whenever I can. But these, I suppose, are precisely what you are without. Perhaps that is not possible for anyone. But it has been the study of my life to avoid those weaknesses which often expose a strong understanding to ridicule, such as vanity and pride. Yes, vanity is a weakness indeed, but pride, where there is a real superiority of mind, pride will always be under good regulation. Elizabeth turned away to hide a smile. Your examination of Mr. Darcy is over, I presume, said Miss Bingley. And pray, what is the result? I am perfectly convinced by it that Mr. Darcy has no defect. He owns it himself without disguise. No, said Darcy, I have made no such pretension. I have faults enough, but they are not, I hope, of understanding. My temper I dare not vouch for. It is, I believe, too little yielding. Certainly too little for the convenience of the world. I cannot forget the follies and vices of others so soon as I ought, nor their offences against myself. My feelings are not puffed about with every attempt to move them. My temper would perhaps be called resentful. My good opinion, once lost, is lost forever. That is a failing indeed, cried Elizabeth. Implacable resentment is a shade in a character. But you have chosen your fault well. I really cannot laugh at it. You are safe from me. There is, I believe, in every disposition a tendency towards some particular evil, a natural defect which not even the best education can overcome. And your defect is a propensity to hate everybody. And yours, he replied with a smile, is wilfully to misunderstand them. Do let us have a little music, cried Miss Bingley, tired of a conversation in which she had no chair. Louisa, you will not mind my waking Mr. Hurst? Her sister made not the smallest objection, and the pianoforte was opened, and Darcy, after a few moments' recollection, was not sorry for it. He began to feel the danger of paying Elizabeth too much attention.
Well, that was a good place to end it.
So dangerous.
How are we doing?
So many thoughts on this book. It's so good.
Good. I love just the little things like I fixed my own pens. Check me out.
Caroline Bingley is so thirsty.
I find her kind of sort of appallingly relatable.
Yeah. Like,
yeah.
When she's going on about Lizzie's eyes with just the sheer, like, oh, her eyes, fuck's sake.
Yeah.
You're gonna marry her.
Yeah. Winch your tongue back in, Caroline.
Yeah, Frankie, you're like, I was saying to Kitty, like, God damn, you make her sound so unctuous. Just like the way those run-on sentences becoming.
So apparently,
Persuasion, Frankie.
What's that, my love?
Have you seen the Channel 3? I think it was the Channel 3 version of Persuasion. I think it was like 2007 it came out.
Ooh, who's it got in it?
Oh gosh, no, it's got the lady who was in The Shape of Water, whose name I can't remember, but she's an awesome actress.
Ooh, I don't know.
Anyway, like another Bennett, another Austen character in Persuasion, who's just like the most annoying person, possibly the most annoying character in all of literature ever. Anyway, he managed to channel like a bit of that into Caroline Bingley, which is
oh my god, amazing!
Like the parallels are perfect.
Have you seen Death Comes to Pemberley, the BBC adaptation?
I haven't, with Anna Maxwell Martin in, isn't it?
Who's she?
She is the lady. What is in it?
Who does she play?
She plays Elizabeth Bennet.
I mean, what I was
no spoilers. Also, no spoilers.
I'm not spoiling. What I appreciated most about it is that Lydia is played by the actress who plays Clara in Doctor who I find intensely irritating.
Perfect. I find her intensely irritating as well.
But she makes a great Lydia.
so,
what were you going to say, love?
oh no, I was going to go back to an earlier point, but about descriptions of Miss Bingley and do a comparison to Lydia. But let's.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
So basically the same. The difference is money.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, in the words which Jane Austen used are Lydia was a stout, well-grown girl of 15 with a fine complexion and good-humoured countenance. With a bit of guessing at what that was meant. She's basically very well endowed and doesn't look 15. So that's part of the reason why she's so sexed up or popular amongst the officers, as it were. So so it's a that was something that
I don't know about that. Like she's popular amongst the officers because she's a dirty great flirt, and I think she probably would be regardless of what.
It's been implied in an yeah, absolutely. So I guess it's more that was one of the potential understandings for what those words meant.
I've honestly never even remotely considered it.
What were the words exactly again, Ben? I just want to listen.
Stout and well-grown girl with a fine complexion and good human countenance.
Yeah, I think it's just that she's, like she's not like a little kind of little kid. Yeah.
The officers love hanging out with her because she's like amazing at squats. They do like challenges and stuff.
Got the
Are you off, Katie, my darling?
She can bench more than anyone in the family, including Mr. Bennett.
Yeah, she just.
Of course, including Mr. Bennett.
She's arm wrestled.
Did.
Yeah, she's like arm wrestled the entire barracks. She's like their mascot.
She spends the like boring evenings just benching all of her sisters in turn.
Fuck, I really want to see this production with Lydia.
Poor Mary. I just imagine Mary kind of reading a book while Olivia.
Poor Mary. All I've ever wanted is to read a book while someone benches me. That's all I want in life. Rory! So, Gordon.
Yeah.
How did you feel about it? Like, Gordon, I'm very interested to hear all of you as a Pride and Prejudice virgin.
I have
very
no.
interested to hear your thoughts.
So the main thing, apart from how funny it is ridiculous. I love that Caroline Bingley, because obviously Darcy is just a dick. Like, he's just obnoxious. I've no idea what age he's supposed to be. Like, I imagine, because he feels young, but maybe not that young. Like, maybe he's 30, he could be old, or is he like 20?
25?
Yeah.
About 25, 26.
So he has that sort of, and he's such a fucking, like, there's so many modern day people that I know that are just him, just being like, oh no, I'm so like, oh, he's such a dick.
Yeah.
But then Caroline comes in and just steals the show by just being so much more
That's
awful
so much.
than he is, which I just love. Although I don't know if it's her or your ability to pronounce country people and country things in such a way that's like, whoa, that's harsh, but it really feels that.
I mean, I don't think that was necessarily Jane Austen's intention.
On the topic of potential route.
Well,
Sorry,
I was just saying, but we're getting the Frankie version, which is the version we want.
On the topic of potential rudeness, there was a line which was, Darcy can go hug himself.
Yeah.
Is that like a typo, or is that what it's supposed to mean? Or
No, it's like as in he can hug himself, like he can congratulate himself on being not able to be teased. Because I think it's Miss Bingley who says that, who presumably means it in all sincerity, whereas Elizabeth would be like, "Go hug yourself."
Go hug yourself, mate. Off you go.
This is so great. I've
It
enjoyed
really
it.
is the ultimate rom-com, isn't it? You know,
It's just
contradictory.
everything.
You know, they hate each other and they meet. And, yeah.
Well, but who knows what will happen? Who knows what will happen? They hate each other so much. I mean,
Well, but he doesn't hate her. Like it's very clear in the writing. Like he's besotted by her. He just thinks she's scum.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like I like that the text is already just telling us that. It's like, oh no, he's into her. Like he's okay. And he does, like he's got a whole section where it's difficult, like obviously knowing what's meant by some things that are written then. Is it just the language of the time and what we read out of it? So there's a bit where, you know, like when Mrs. Bennet is saying, oh, I don't want to expose myself, we know she's not meaning exposing herself. But there's an entire section where Darcy is talking to, is talking to Bingley, and he's like, yeah, you're all about speed and finishing quickly as if it's great. But I take my time and make it last a long time. So it's like, what is he throwing shade there? I don't know. Maybe that.
I love this particular, like, the listening to like the dude's comments on this book, and Ben's being like, oh yeah, so Lydia's got a big rack, and Gordon is like, oh yeah, that's a dick joke, right? Like, whoa, come on, guys.
I think it's really interesting because we have just been listening to or watching Sharp, which is of the same, like, set in the same time period, and it is very, very, very different media. It's all like set in like army camps and stuff like that, and it's all very racy and heterosexual. But like the fact that they have like a lot of dick jokes in Sharp, I think, but it's of the same time period, so you can definitely see the difference between like men's media and women's media of the time, I guess, to a certain extent, of like especially with this being like a book that is for, like, I guess, society people more than anything else.
But this one was written in the time, whereas Sharp was written.
That's true, but it doesn't necessarily mean that portrayal is completely untrue either, because like there were still yeah.
Incidentally, on a related note, last night when someone was positing the question about like Bingley and Darcy are from like different kind of backgrounds, they didn't meet at school, so how do they know each other? Both Kitty and I simultaneously said Grindr, just independently.
There is a point where Lizzie wants to run gaily away. And so when Darcy was like, there's 2 reasons that you two are taking a turn around, basically walking up and down the room. And the 2 reasons are, 1, because you're hot for each other and you want to just have some time. And 2, you're just trying to get your 10,000 steps in. And those are the only 2 reasons you could be walking down the room.
Yes.
The other non-sexy thing, the other non-sexy thing is this entire book, I'm like, you aristos need to do some fucking work. Like, you're sitting around going, I'm so bored. I'm like, Industrial Revolution is about to start. I don't know, do something. Stop.
I was thinking, how do people feel about this? And I will need to have a get hold of it and have a look over it again because I can't remember that much about it. There's a book by, I believe, Joe Baker called Longbourn. Has anyone read that? It's a novel written with, and like the main character is the Bennet's housemaid, and so it's kind of her life. Like, so not even like telling the events of the novel from her perspective, because like it's sort of telling about her life and her kind of her story below stairs, and it's sort of like there's these like odd moments where it like just touches on the events and the kind of and the sort of the things that are happening in Pride and Prejudice, like at the same time very much like dictate her life, but are also totally divorced from her. And like that's quite an interesting, like it kind of goes into life below stairs and the sort of, you know, like the non-country house, like kind of leisured living of that age. And like I thought potentially once we've got through this, if people would be interested, we could consider that as like a follow-on for Storytime. Because it's also, you know, a good novel, like it's a good, interesting, kind of intriguing story. But I thought that might be a nice companion piece in terms of looking at literally the same book, but from below stairs.
That sounds really interesting. I have not read this, but I have heard a little bit about it. And am I right in saying that there are some like content warnings that go with that book?
I can't remember. I've read it about 5 years ago, and the only bit that I can really remember is there's like, because there's a couple of sentences that are like the only mentions of servants in Pride and Prejudice that are kind of pulled out and like things are constructed, and one of them is about shoe roses. Like there's a bit where like it was raining too hard for the ladies to go out and get their own shoe roses. So like a servant has to be sent to get the shoe roses, and it's her. So it's like her kind of describing having to go out in this like fucking miserable, rainy, muddy day to get these fucking shoe roses for the ball. But yeah, I can't remember anything else about it. So I've got it back at the house. So I'll get hold of it and reread it and see if it's suitable.
Is it sweeter than Pride and Prejudice? Because Pride and Prejudice is hella snipey.
Yeah, I think it's probably, I mean, it would be difficult to be less sweet than Pride and Prejudice.
That would be nice.
It is so snipey. It's so snipey. Hold on. I must stop the recording. But everyone say goodbye to the catch-up crew.
Catch-up crew.
Hello. Catch-up crew. Goodbye.